First of all, I rarely say this. I've done a few of these as a moderator. I just absolutely loved this book. I couldn't put it down. So I'm starting by saying how wildly entertaining it is.
Peter,
And it
thank you.
shows.
That's really
You're
terrific.
welcome.
I really appreciate that.
You can pay me later.
Yeah.
And your enjoyment in writing this, I think, showed. So my first question is on the very first page. In fact, you say that the other subjects of this series, of which there are 50 or so, I believe, have all been admirable and in a way heroic. Bugsy Siegel is hardly admirable. You also say a little later how seductive he was. So did he seduce you as you did your research and writing?
Well, that's a good question. I guess there are two answers to it. First, why Yale University Press decided to do Bugsy, because as you say, they've had this wonderful series going, Jewish Lives, which is now up to 50 short biographies of all these distinguished people. Why Bugsy Siegel? And actually, I think it was our editor-in-chief, Eileen Smith, who, as much as anyone, who said, why not include a Jewish gangster? I mean, gangsters were part of the Jewish American experience of the late 19th, early 20th century. Shouldn't they be somewhere in this? And I just happened to be sitting next to Eileen at a dinner. I asked her what she was doing next, looking for, she said, a writer for Bugsy Siegel. I said, I'm your guy, which of course was completely apocryphal because I had not written exactly about casinos, but I had written with Harry Belafonte, his memoir, by the way, for Peter. And Harry's time in the casinos of Las Vegas was fascinating. So it was a world that intrigued me. I wanted to know more, and I thought, let's do it. So that was the genesis.
So there's so much to talk about here, really. This could go on for hours. I'm not kidding.
Let's do it.
The easiest way to sort of get through his life as comprehensively as possible. And by the way, you write much more than just about Bugsy Siegel's life. You write about the era and the sort of sociology of Bugsy and his criminal cohorts. So starting chronologically, let's start with the Lower East Side of New York, which is where he grew up. And by the way, I will say one thing. I do have another connection, which I think we'll probably get to a bit later. Yes, but on the Lower East Side was a very famous Jewish dairy restaurant called Ratner's, where all these gangsters hung out. And my mother's family started and owned Ratner's. So
there you go.
So there are ties. But let's describe what life was like on the Lower East Side and how Bugsy and his best friend, another gangster, came out of there.
Well, sure. I mean, it was a dreadful, difficult, miserable life on the Lower East Side. And for the millions, literally, of immigrants who came from Eastern Europe, as Bugsy's did, it was really hard. First of all, most of them only spoke Yiddish. They were subject to enormous prejudice. I should say Ben. We have to get used to calling him Ben Siegel. If you called him Bugsy, you might not survive the encounter. But Ben saw what his father, how his father had ended up. He worked in a factory as a pants presser for pennies a day, and Ben was just not going to do that. He was not going to let himself have that kind of life. So he kind of went out into the streets by the age of 10 or 11 years old, and he was doing all the sort of petty crimes that kids did down there. Threatening pushcart peddlers unless they gave him a little money every week, threatening to engage in arson. And at one of these occasions, when he was maybe 14 years old, he was involved in some sort of confrontation and was holding a gun. And a young gangster who was sort of observing this pulled Ben aside and said, what are you doing? The police are about to come around the corner. Get rid of that gun. So the guy did, and the two became close friends, and that guy was Meyer Lansky. And Meyer Lansky and Ben Siegel were the best of friends all through the rest of their lives until the very end, which I gets us just a little ahead of the game for a second. There is some speculation still that the guy who shot Ben on June 20th, 1947, through a window in a house in Beverly Hills, that person may have been Meyer Lansky. So it's a fascinating bromance.
Which that would put a damper on a friendship, I would say.
So, these guys, they were great partners together because Meyer was actually sort of short, and he was brilliant actually at numbers, but he was a very controlled, careful, contained guy. Ben was the opposite, as his nickname suggested. So they kind of balanced each other out. And then came the event that completely transformed their lives, Prohibition, in 1920. And soon enough, these guys, who are literally like 14 and 18 years old, were protecting convoys of bootleggers at night, and doing things at the orders of Arnold the Brain Rothstein, and just generally making a first fortune. That's what
you make the point, Mike, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you make the point that I think is really interesting, that a lot of normal business, the sort of climbing the corporate ladder, was shut off to Jews in those days.
Right.
And so the gangsterism, in a way, was their response to capitalism.
Exactly right.
Was really an interesting point.
It was a point actually that Malcolm Gladwell made in an essay at one point. He used this phrase, the crooked ladder. And his point was, really, you're making it, that these guys didn't come to America wanting to commit crimes. The Italian mob, that was another story. They've been around for hundreds of years. They were proud of their malfeasance. The Jewish gangsters came to the Lower East Side for the most part, and they really couldn't get work unless they wanted to be pants pressers. So they really had to go out and commit the crimes that they did to establish themselves and to seize their piece of the American dream. And what's interesting is that a generation later, if you describe a generation as perhaps 20 years, nearly all of them were gone. As soon as they had the opportunity to go legit and put their kids in good private schools, the whole ethos, the whole generation of Jewish gangsters essentially evaporated.
Well, there was another route. You talk about all these different influences on Bugsy. Yeah. Sorry, Ben. Although I think if I was alive, then I would have had the nerve to call him Bugsy, by the way. But one of the things, his father was an influence in a weird way, in a negative way, especially about money. And the other relationship that is so interesting was Ben's brother, who did take a different route out. Can you just sort of talk about the two of them and how they interacted with Siegel? Sure.
Well, perhaps not unlike criminal families, Jewish criminal families. The success story was the criminal, was the young guy who went out and did all the things that earned him a lot of money. And that was Ben in his family. And I spoke to one of his granddaughters who said that there was the perhaps inevitable conflict of feelings about this. They were happy to be getting money, but they were embarrassed about how it was coming into them. And as a way perhaps to atone for this, or to make himself feel more part of the family, he put his brother Maurice through medical school. And the kids, there were 5 of them, 3 daughters, started with Ben, then 3 daughters, and then Maurice the youngest, actually went to medical school in LA. He became a fairly distinguished doctor, an internist, I think. And so, when, as his granddaughter said, when they asked him about Ben, he was very closed-mouthed about it. He admitted that Ben had put him through college, but he didn't want to say anything else. I think because he felt guilty about the fact that he'd taken that money from his brother, and yet, found him to be the reprobate that he was.
So Prohibition comes, Ben Siegel becomes kind of insanely wealthy, considering he's probably 21 or 22 years old at this point.
Exactly. Literally living in a suite in the Waldorf Astoria by that point. And there's a funny moment when he liked to throw water balloons out the window.
He was a kook.
And at one point, Albert Anastasia turns to him and says, "Ben, what are you doing? What are you doing with these water balloons?" And he says, "Oh, I liked it. I like it. I like throwing them down." So yes, he was a bit of a kook, but he was a very wealthy one. That continued right through Prohibition. But the problem was Prohibition ended, and then they all had to kind of reinvent themselves.
And how did he reinvent himself?
Well, Meyer Lansky reinvented himself by going down to Florida and essentially taking over all the games down there, the horse races, the nightclubs. He elbowed into all that stuff. But that left a whole other new territory for Ben, which was L.A. And Ben went out to L.A. literally just as Prohibition was ending. And the first call he made was to his dear friend, George Raft, the gangster turned actor, who had his big breakthrough in Scarface in 1932. Well, they had grown up in the same area. They had friends in common. And actually, what Ben wanted above all was to be an actor, just like George. There are very amusing details about how that worked for him. He literally went to the set of the movies that George Raft was making, and he brought his own 16 millimeter camera, and he had another actor film him saying the lines that George Raft had just said in the movie to show everybody what a great actor he was.
It's crazy.
And as Raft later said, he was pretty good. But, imagine what would happen if he went in for a part, auditioned with some casting director and didn't get it. He'd probably be killed. So instead of that, he concentrated on being sort of an actor manqué. He went to this great barber shop called Drucker's, where you would, just get the whole works every day. And then he would, dress in some beautiful $200 suit with a $25 monogram shirt. And he would go out there looking like an actor, looking like a, man on top of the world. But actually, when you think about it, it was a very effective method or effective means of getting the money that he was, holding up all these nightclubs and racetracks and whatnot with. When they saw this guy coming in like this, he was serious. He was not to be trifled with. And the other thing he did when he first got there was to get involved with the race wire, namely there was horse racing. Horse racing was legal, but then there was this illegal race wire business where they could actually run the information, the results of the race, by telegraph up to bookies waiting somewhere else, and they could make their profits by doing that, and that was an enormously lucrative gig for Ben. So he did all that. He established a new life that way, and he became so wealthy that he took it upon himself to build this enormous mansion up in Holmby Hills. And actors like, Cary Grant and Frank Sinatra and Jimmy Stewart would come to the mansion and would gamble and have a fine time. Although they began to notice that he would at some point sidle up to them and ask them for a loan. and indeed, one after another of these actors was obligated to give Ben, quite a few $100s with the pretext that some great project was happening, some restaurant he was going to open or whatever. But this was also, this was the LA of Chinatown. I mean, this was the 30s. It was an incredibly sort of lurid, loose time. And anyway, so that was
a judge once told me years ago, I'll never forget this, and reading your book really reminded me of this, that he said it started out that actors used to imitate the criminals and their mannerisms, but as gangster movies became more popular, the gangsters actually started imitating the actors playing gangsters, which I thought was
brilliant.
great.
I wish I'd had that in the book. That's brilliant.
One of the things that I loved, and then I'm going to ask you to tell one particular story.
Sure.
Ben Siegel moved in to take over some unions. I think it was the extras union that he got involved in, and but he always went easy on the studio heads. Basically, you said, because deep down he wanted them to hire him as an actor, which just really made me laugh.
Yeah. So actually, not as cold-blooded a character as you might have thought.
Everybody wants to be in show business. Will you tell the Jimmy Stewart story? It's just sort of too good not to tell.
I mean, yes, all these guys I've named would be up there at the mansion in Holmby Hills, and nearly all of them were almost slavishly admiring of Ben. I mean, Frank Sinatra was apparently just agog at this guy. Frank knew the backstory, knew what Ben and Meyer had done in New York, and admired him only the more for that. George Raft was on the scene, and of course was Ben's, best friend, really, and others, as I say, Gary Cooper, but Jimmy Stewart. The first time he went there with his wife, basically turned to Ben and said, you're just the scum of the earth. What do you think you're doing? You're just a criminal. And everybody fell silent because they thought the next thing would happen is that Ben would take out a gun and shoot him. But he didn't. And later in a memoir, his wife said that maybe the one reason why Jimmy Stewart could say that and get away with it is that, first of all, he was pretty tall, and second of all, no one else did that. So Ben was almost kind of fascinated, and that sort of fits a pattern, because later Mickey Cohen, this fierce simian creature who had a real reputation for violence, confronted Ben and refused to give him some money that he owed Ben. And Ben just laughed. He just found this hilarious. And later on, when he started spending time with Virginia Hill, she would challenge him, and he found that amusing as well. So there's something in that. I think you could challenge him, but you had to do it. You had to do it the right way. And indeed, George Raft describes a story of warning a new girlfriend of Ben's, who was an actress, Wendy Barry, I think was her name, became a pretty well-known actress, warning her not to spend time with Ben, and because it would ruin her career. And Wendy, instead of taking that to heart, went back to Ben and said, gee, your best friend says I shouldn't hang out with you because it'll ruin my career. And about 2 days later, Ben comes bursting into George Raft's Coldwater Canyon house with two guns, and he's about to kill his best friend. And George finally says, calm down, Blue Eyes, baby Blue Eyes, just calm down. And this phrase, baby Blue Eyes, was somehow the phrase that could calm Ben down. So George Raft survived that encounter, but just barely.
Well, the Hollywood stuff it's really great. I mean, we could talk, there's just so much in there, but kind of, if we're going chronologically, the next thing happens. And again, one of the things that makes this book so good is it's not just the life of Bugsy Siegel, but it's kind of the history of criminal capitalism of the 20th century, is a little thing that came to be known as Murder, Inc. Mm-hmm. Can you describe that and how it came about? And, because this is when Ben Siegel starts to become a little less seductive and appealing and kind of becomes a stone cold killer.
Yeah, That's true. I would even say he was a cold stone killer back in the Prohibition days when he and Meyer formed what they called the Meyer and Ben mob, and they essentially hired themselves out to kill or maim anybody that the various bootleggers wanted to see killed. Fast forward to the mid 30s. Something very interesting happened in the sort of annals of gangland crime. The two most powerful racketeers, Lepke and Shapiro, were actually arrested, I think by Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor. And there were a lot of crimes to throw at them, so many that Shapiro ran away. He just went out on the lam for about a year. And finally, he came back very depressed, and he was thrown into prison, and he was there for the rest of his life. But Lepke also went on the lam, and for about 2 years, they did not find him. And he, there were all sorts of rumors about where he was living, but he was probably living above a little dance hall in Brooklyn the whole time, where one of his caretakers was Ben Siegel, and where Lepke began planning the demise of all the people who had worked for him. You would have thought that if he was there in hiding, he would be grateful to his henchmen for keeping the secret, and he would trust them. But no, he was paranoid, and his reaction was the opposite. His reaction was try to kill them all. And the means by which he did this was Murder, Inc. And Murder, Inc. was basically, again, Meyer and Ben, a little older, a little wiser, a little quicker to kill. And they would take assignments from the top bosses, Lucky Luciano and Joe Dotto and others, and they would kill people who were perceived as turncoats, even if it meant finding them halfway across the country and killing them in the middle of the night. And there are estimates that as many as 400 people died this way in the mid 30s. So. Ben was part of this. Absolutely, he and Meyer were part of this. And finally, even they began to get sick of all the killings. It's enough, these killings. We got to stop this. And so they fooled.
We need some seltzer. We need to relax.
They fooled Lepke into accepting a deal. What Lepke was really worried about is that Thomas Dewey would find evidence and charge him for murder, and he'd be put in the electric chair. Which, by the way, happened eventually. But at this stage, he thought if he could kill off all those guys, there wouldn't be that evidence. And so he asked Ben and Meyer to murder all the henchmen they could. And it got down to really one guy, Big Harry Greenberg. Big Harry Greenberg, backstory I won't bore you with, but he was on the lam now from Lepke, from Ben, and he had found a little place to live in LA under a highway. He and his wife hiding all day. Somehow his whereabouts were discovered, and Ben set up this elaborate murder scheme. I'll just say this about his murder schemes: they were always more complicated than they needed to be. He just loved forming them. So at any rate, they figured out the very moment every evening that Big Harry came out with the newspapers, and they killed him. This time, Ben was really in trouble because there was a guy named Kid Twist Relis, a whole story and a book in and of himself, who ratted on everybody. All of it. This was Lepke's worst nightmare. Relis ratted on him, ratted on everyone, and on Ben as well. As some of you may know, if you're mafia aficionados, Kid Twist Relis ended up being pushed out of a window on the 6th floor of a Coney Island hotel just before he was going to testify all these guys, including Ben. And as a result, Ben got off. The trial was dismissed. The case was dismissed, and in 1942, he started a new life, having sold his mansion, he had to admit it, he had sort of blotched his school book there. He had ruined his relations with all the Hollywood stars because murdering people was just not really something they admired. And what it meant is that he needed to start a new life somewhere else, and that became Las Vegas and the Flamingo.
All right, before we go into Vegas, two things. One, this is just I just like this connection between Hollywood and gangsters. Yeah. Abe Kid Twist Relis.
Yeah, you got it.
In the movie there was a great movie called Murder Inc., a really, really good movie. Yeah. And Peter Falk played him. And it's what made Peter Falk a giant star, playing one of the gangsters who was thrown off the roof. I think he was either nominated or actually won an Oscar. Right. But before we go to Vegas, I want you to tell one more story about this incredible mansion which had sliding doors with guns stashed behind it and escape hatches. But tell this, I'd never heard this, and it was, I have to say, this is something, I might have called him Bugsy. I would not have had the nerve to do what this reporter did, which is, the guy's name was William Huey. Oh, yeah. Can you tell that story briefly? Because it's incredible. Sure.
The fact is that Ben had this mansion. He invited all these people over, and while that was going on, a young reporter named Bill Huey read about Ben in the LA papers and was intrigued, just thought he'd go see what he could find. So rather cleverly, he arrived at the back door with a stack of magazines and newspapers saying that he was selling subscriptions. And Ben happened to be off on some gambit in a boat off Costa Rica, which I won't bore you with here. But therefore, there was just the wife, Esther, who was sort of lonely. And she let him in. And soon enough, he was not just the newspaper guy, he was the sort of nanny for the two girls. And he would take them horseback riding to the stable where Elizabeth Taylor rode, and he would make their dinners for them. It was Christmas, he did the Christmas tree. And then on about January 2nd, back comes Ben from his various travels. And Hoy was horrified, thought that he was going to be found out immediately and killed, but he stuck with it. And for about a week, he lived with Ben and Ben's wife and kids as Ben held these, midnight meetings with other gangsters. It's really great color. He would hang out talking to Ben's father, who by now had retired from the pants pressing factory and was being supported by his son, no doubt causing more conflicting feelings. Hoy got a lot of good color for the story he was going to write, and was lucky enough to get out just in time.
But he also snuck into his office, into Ben Siegel's office at night, and went through papers and took papers and got gambling connections that no one knew about and things like that.
Right. It was great reporting, but very risky, because the floors were carpeted. And I remember this detail. And at any time, someone, even just another servant, could have come around and seen him rummaging through these files. But he, according to him, he got away with all this. And a few days after he left, claiming that his mother was sick in Arizona or something, the cops came to the mansion door, and Ben sort of gave them this one-sided smile, and he said, "So, did you bring Bill, Huey with you?" and clearly he had figured out in those 3 days that this guy was who he was, and that and I think it's fair to say that Bill Hoy might not have survived if he'd stuck around another week.
Yeah, I would say definitely. So, okay, so now it's time to go to the thing that everybody remembers him for. Let's go to Vegas.
Yeah. Well, Ben had been intrigued by casinos for quite a while. As you probably know, 1931 was the big year in Nevada when everything became legal, from any kind of gambling to prostitution to marriage, quickie marriages, quickie divorces. And Ben could see promise in that, but he didn't really get to it until the early 40s, when he just beat the rap for Big Harry. What he started doing to sort of educate himself was to muscle in on all the little small casinos. They called them the wagon wheel and sawdust casinos. But that gave him this idea that what he really wanted was to create his own far larger casino that he would call a carpet joint. Instead of sawdust, carpet. This was the definition of class. And so he tried to buy either of the largest major casinos, and one was not for sale. One eventually was. He bought that one. But neither one of them fulfilled his dream. He wanted his own place. And so the story goes, and it's actually recounted beautifully in the movie, the Bugsy movie that Barry Levinson directed. And I'm told he may be with us tonight. So hello, if you are. It's a wonderful movie.
I edited his novel, by the way, if he's here.
What's that?
I edited Barry Levinson's novel. So I hope he's
there we go. Anyway, it was either Ben or Meyer Lansky, they both took credit, who first saw this open plot of land just south of Las Vegas with tumbleweeds, and Ben would say for the rest of his life that it was his insight that this could be the Flamingo. As for why, by the way, the Flamingo, many theories. One of them that he and Meyer liked to hang out in Florida watching the flamingos down there. Another that it had to do with certain sexual capabilities on the part of Virginia Hill. That the list goes on. But the Flamingo it was, and Ben convinced the Eastern mob, his pals, that he could do this on a couple $1 million, which is a lot of money at that time. But as the months went on, it became clearer that the sums would far exceed that, because Ben didn't know what he was doing. He thought he knew what he was doing. He even brought in a wonderful character of the times named Billy Wilkerson, who had started restaurants in LA like Ciro's, and he had a waxed mustache, and he liked wearing tails, and he was a very elegant guy, almost a caricature. But he really knew how to design the inside of a restaurant, or in this case, a casino. But of course, only weeks after Ben came onto the project himself and hired Billy Wilkerson, Ben decided that Wilkerson was a jerk and couldn't do anything, and Ben would do it all himself. The result being that everybody took advantage of him. And when the supply trucks came in, through the gate, they would give him the paperwork, he would give it back, and then 2 hours later, they'd come right around with the same stuff in the back of their truck and do it again. And he was too either bugsy or oblivious to realize he was being handled like that. So it took eventually $6 million before this casino was finished almost finished by early 1946. And of course, by now, Ben's former admiring cohorts were apoplectic. They'd seen their money evaporate. In fact, they thought it was worse than that. They had begun to suspect that Virginia Hill, who merits a book on her own, and has gotten a couple, that Virginia was skimming. And they thought that she had been a terrible influence on Ben, and that he too was skimming. Well, you don't do that. You can't, that's one rule you can't break in mob land. So there was a meeting held, a very famous meeting in December in Havana. And all the, Lucky Luciano on down, were all there to discuss a few things. But the biggest issue was Ben Siegel and what to do about him, because the Flamingo had still not opened, and it was still just gushing money. And so the conclusion was basically that Ben had gone too far and he was going to get killed. Why he didn't get killed then in the next few weeks, I don't know. But maybe it was because people wanted to hope that the Flamingo would open in time and would get them some of their money back. It did open. It was a fiasco. This is December 1946. So much so that Ben actually closed it down for 3 months, tried to fix it up, get everything done, and then reopened in March, and actually finally began making some money, and thought probably that he was in the clear, that even if his buddies had been talking about killing him, they would feel fine once they were making money. And he felt that right up to the night of June 20th, 1947, when he was shot to death. Clearly, he was wrong.
Before you go into your theories, which, as I told you earlier, I thought were just really smart and interesting about how he was actually killed, because it has never been totally solved or proven. Talk a little bit about Virginia Hill, who is an extraordinarily interesting and kind of equally crazy character.
Yeah, fascinating character. Well, in brief, she was born a very poor but beautiful girl in a little town called Bessemer, Alabama. She ends up going to Chicago with the World's Fair on that year. She ingratiates herself with the mob, the Chicago mob. She becomes a bag lady, not in that sense, but I mean, entrusted with bags of cash, lettuce, they called it. And somehow she met Ben. And actually, the first person she met was an accountant named Joe Epstein, who was an older guy, sort of, heavy-set guy who just adored her and basically supported her for years. Anyway, in the early 40s, Virginia met Ben, and Ben was absolutely besotted with her, not just because she was beautiful and sexy, as all accounts agree, but because, as I started to say earlier, she was completely unintimidated by him, and he loved that. So they became a very, very intense couple. And Virginia, once the Flamingo started getting built, she couldn't resist becoming part of the staff, designing, in fact, the whole casino in what most people say was a very garish way. It's unclear whether she really loved Ben, or if part of this was just the excitement of being involved in this project and the money that flowed in. Hard to say. What's more interesting, though, is what happened after Ben died. She had decided out of the blue a month before to go to Paris. And she'd never been there. She was 29 years old. She'd never been to Paris. And she took 75 fur coats with her. Why she needed them in Paris in the early summer, anybody's guess. She was there in Paris, leaving Ben the free reign of her mansion on Linden Avenue, Linden Drive. And she found herself hanging out with this Champagne family, the Fouillettes, whatever the names are. And meanwhile, back in LA, Ben was trying desperately to raise more money for the Flamingo, and he was living in her house. She had given them the golden key that fit the lock, literally, and so then he's killed. There were all sorts of suspects, including some of the people who worked for Ben, including the race wire guys who were really angry at him because he'd been taking, money from their profits in the race wire and these various, and also Virginia Hill's own younger brother, Chick, was a likely suspect because in recent months, Ben and Virginia had become more and more acrimonious with each other, and there was possibly some physical abuse that Chick would have wanted to try to stop. But then there's also the possibility that Meyer Lansky or his people, did the job as promised back there in Havana. My own theory is, of course, like any theory, completely impossible to substantiate, but Nick Pileggi thinks I may be right. So the great writer about mobs, the Goodfella writer, agreed to some extent with what I feel, which is that Virginia knew that Ben was going to be killed because he had skimmed, and it was only the question of who would kill him. If some hired gun killed Ben, then Virginia would still be on the list to be killed herself because she had skimmed money and it was in Switzerland, and the mob wanted that money back. But if she had been able to say to Joe Dodo and Lucky Luciano and the others, I can set this up so that Ben, is out of the picture if you'll let me keep my money in Switzerland. And so what gives some credence to that is that when mafia guys kill other mafia guys, it's with a gun, it's with a handgun. It's never with a rifle, as Pileggi pointed out, never with a rifle. Or they take someone out to the desert and bury him there, But Ben was killed that night with a rifle. And Chick, Virginia's younger brother, had just come back from the military where he specialized in automatic rifles in training. And so I think that that the mob used Virginia's help to have someone, maybe Chick himself, maybe someone else, kill Ben, and Virginia, as a result, was able to go free. And I'll just conclude by saying, sort of poignant, she didn't really go free. She was tormented by guilt, and she tried to kill herself on at least 6 occasions with sleeping pills, until finally she was in the town of Klosters, Switzerland, and she managed to succeed in killing herself. To me, this is part of the theory that she may have realized. I mean, she obviously, if I'm right, she knew she had traded Ben's life for her own, and that might have been a very difficult thing for anybody to live with, especially someone who had actually loved him.
So and before you have questions, I will just say to come full circle with the Hollywood and gangster connections. So I'm sure everyone watching and listening has seen the Godfather, and the way Mo Green was killed,
yes,
which was shot through the eye, is exactly the way Ben Siegel was killed, shot in the eye. And truly, the way Michael describes it, it's rather gruesome.
Well, but, I'm glad you raised that, Peter, because there's no doubt that that Coppola took that from the shooting of.
Had to have.
Ben. Oh, absolutely, and in fact, the real life shooting of Ben Siegel was done with 9 shots from a turbine or a rifle right behind him. That person was standing outside, and in fact, he was shot through the eye. One of the 5 shots actually did go through his eye, to the extent that it actually was propelled to the opposite wall. And we know this because a gossip columnist named Florabelle Muir, I think her name was, got to the house first before any other journalist and measured the distance between him lying on the Davenport and the eye that was pinned to the other wall. So rough business.
And on that note, we should start taking questions.
I'm still stuck on a hardcore gangster dropping water balloons onto Park Avenue. That's right. That's right. The photo that's gonna stick with me, I think. So we have covered a lot of ground, but we have some questions from the audience, and I encourage anyone who still has questions to send them to us in the chat. But the first one I think we'll start with this evening is from Laura. Laura asks, what was the most enjoyable part of researching or writing the book? And what was the most challenging part of researching and writing the book?
Well, that's a good question. One of the most enjoyable aspects was spending a day with Wendy, Ben Siegel's granddaughter, but hearing some of the family stories. she herself, I mean, Ben had died before she was born. So, I mean, you know, but there was family lore nonetheless. And I enjoyed that. I actually have to say one of my favorite experiences was discovering this wonderful biography of Bugsy by a guy named Dean Jennings. And it was called We Only Shoot Each Other. And Dean Jennings was a kind of shoe leather, you know, tabloid kind of reporter who was resourceful enough back in the mid 60s to interview some of the people who were so important in this story, like George Raft, or indeed like Virginia's brother Chick. All that, those wonderful anecdotes, they only come from one place, which is Dean Jennings, who was, you know, to whom I felt incredibly grateful because he wrote them in his biography. So, I mean, I think it's, you know, you're talking about a guy who died, whatever, 70 years ago, whatever it is, who obviously didn't write his own story, who about whom stories were written, which may have been apocryphal. So, you know, there's a lot that's hard to pin down, but all the more reason why that colorful biography, which was also very well written, you know, did some of that pinning down for me.
You do a very good job, by the way, of giving different sides to the same story when there are different sides. So even the discovery of the site for the Flamingo Hotel, you kind of make it sound like it's a psychotic high school because everybody wants credit for doing, you know, finding the site for building Vegas.
Yes, yes.
So, but you do a good job of showing here are the different possibilities. Here's what I think.
Yeah, well, certainly that moment of seeing this land of 33 acres out there, you know, was a moment that, you know, success has 1,000 fathers, right? I mean, for Lansky to have claimed vehemently later that it was his idea, for Ben to have said the same, and indeed for Billy Wilkerson, the guy with the, you know, wax mustache, they all claimed that they had the idea first. And it's fun to give them each their voices.
We have another question from Hillary. Beyond your wonderful anecdotes, what was the moral or historical arc of Bugsy's life? Why ultimately was he important to history?
Great question. Well, the thing that first comes to mind is that, you know, he did, despite all the cost overruns, et cetera, he really does get credit, I think, for building the Flamingo and thus for creating not just the first large casino in Vegas, because there were a couple of those before, but the sort of first Monaco-style elegant casino hotel where not only was there, you know, 24-hour gambling, but there was great entertainment. I mean, you know, people like Lena Horne or Harry Belafonte. And the, you know, the money that he spent, I mean, he could spend thousands of dollars on a, you know, first-rate entertainer there for the weekend. But that was the sort of thing which gave the Flamingo its élan, its frisson, and made it succeed. So I think he, you know, when you go to Vegas, you see all those other places and every one of them has a show. In a funny way, all of those places have a legacy, a debt to Ben. But just for a moment, the other part of your question is why, you know, what else can we say about him in the nature of sort of a legacy? I think that, you know, he, like these other Jewish gangsters, he really did try to earn his way out of gangsterdom, and you know, to try to seize, as I say, the, you know, the American dream in its own way. I think he deserves some sympathy or at least interest for that. But I will also say this, and this didn't occur to me till after the book was done, but you can say some positive things about Ben. You can say he was charming, dapper, you know, all this sort of stuff. Loyal, actually. I think you can say he was loyal to his family mobsters, and in a sense to his wife. But on the other hand, this is a guy who did business with a gun, and it's not really that ultimately heroic or acceptable, remotely so, to kill people to get done what you want to do. And in fact, I would say it's cowardliness. I mean, but it is part of, it's cowardly, and yet it's part of this Jewish American time and period. And so for that too, I think he, has a message for us.
And it's part of the whole Wild West culture that America was reared on, basically.
Yeah. Absolutely. It is a Wild West thing. It's going from the Lower East Side out to LA, and just embracing the whole China ethos. We were saying this earlier, Peter, but he loved to describe himself in LA as a sportsman. That's what he was. And so if you asked him what's a sportsman, he would say somebody who went to the track, someone who entertained, someone who, I don't know, whatever. Whereas in fact, a sportsman in real definition was someone who muscled in on nightclubs and restaurants, who killed people who got in his way. That was the kind of sportsman he really was.
And lest we forget that we are talking about a criminal. A question from Kenneth. Are there stories of Ben and Meyer killing people by having them drink lye?
I don't know about that. All I know is that there were a few people quoted in various books of the time who described Ben as someone who was kind of sick, in the sense that he actually took pleasure in doing these hits himself, and in terrifying the people who were about to die. It's funny that can, if that's true, I mean, again, how much do we know is true? We don't, but if that's true, how curious that in the end we still sort of find him a sympathetic character, someone who intrigues us. There's a review in the Times last Friday, and the reviewer, who's a great authority on the subject, said, at the end of this story, one is almost inclined to say, to feel sadness, to feel sad that this man has died. And I suppose there is something to that. And it also just suggests his ability to charm, and how far that got him.
We have another question here. Despite Warren Beatty's Bugsy, do you feel there could be Hollywood interest in your book as a series, perhaps?
Yes, if we could meet in the corner after this. No, I do think there is a different movie from the one which Barry Levinson did so beautifully. He focused on the whole, the last part of Ben's life, the Flamingo and Virginia Hill and all that, quite sensibly. I think there's a whole other movie in his youth and his friendship with Meyer Lansky. And I find it fascinating, as I said before, that Meyer may have either actually killed his lifetime friend because of the rule that he'd broken, or at the very least sanctioned someone else to do the work. And that's an amazing relationship. And they, from the moment they met at that fight, with the gun in the Lower East Side, until Ben actually did die, these guys were incredibly close all the time. And of course also criminals all the time. And that's a movie I'd like to see. So,
well, we haven't had a chance to talk. There's so many other things in this book that in an hour you can't really talk about. But one of the things that's so interesting too he and Meyer Lansky, and I guess more than the others, even Lucky Luciano, also basically came up with the idea of the mafia families.
Yeah.
And you write about that. And it really is one of the reasons, not just Vegas, but they kind of created the whole structure of the modern mob.
They did, absolutely, Peter. I'm glad you brought that up. You know, before those guys took over, there was what they called the War of the Mustache Petes. And the Mustache Petes were these guys from Sicily and Italy who'd come over. Actually, they've been banished by Mussolini, of all things. And they came over, and each side was, you know, trying to extinguish the other side. Eventually, so many of them were killed that they all kind of slunk off. And Lucky Luciano was clever enough to take over, and even more so, not to try to set himself up as the boss of bosses. He was, but he didn't say so. What he did was to create these families and to create this idea of a syndicate that was kind of, you know, crony capitalism or crime capitalism, if you will. And by allocating power among the families, it kept them satisfied and kept Luciano in control. So that absolutely did help establish the structure of gangland crime, along with, of course, what the Italian mafia was doing as well. It was all about making money. As one of them, I forget which one, said, you know, it's just about the money, which I guess ultimately it was.
So we're still getting a lot of questions in from the audience. I'm going to pose two more to you, Michael, before we wrap up here this evening.
Mm-hmm.
We have one from Eileen. Michael, you've written one of the very best books in the Jewish Lives series and put your gangster right up there with Marx, Freud, and Einstein. If I remember correctly, Bugsy gave to the UJA, the United Jewish Appeal Federation, unusual for a murderer to also be a philanthropist.
Right.
What was up with that?
Well, first of all, thank you, Eileen. Eileen is my editor and had the idea for this book, and has been a great supporter, and that's very touching to hear from her. I appreciate it. Yes, well, actually, all the gangsters gave money, especially right after the war, to the state of Israel. I mean, they were as horrified by the Holocaust as anybody. And so one day, Ben is sitting in Ciro's restaurant, the one that was started by Billy Wilkerson, the guy with the wax mustache. When he gets a call from this, what turns out to be this Israeli military officer, and the guy comes around to make a pitch, essentially a fundraising pitch, to help raise money to establish the state of Israel. And Ben hears him out for a while, and then he leans forward and he says, "Let me just ask you something. Is this just going to be one of these kind of like PR campaigns where, you know, you give a little money to the synagogue?" And the guy says, "No, I'm an Army officer, and what we're engaged with here is whatever it takes to get our land." And Ben says, "You mean you'd kill people?" And the military guy says, "Yes, we would." And Ben says, "Okay, you got my money," and gives him a big paper bag of money. And for each of the next 10 weeks that this military guy was in and around Hollywood raising money from the studio heads, the end of every week, a big paper bag of money would come to him from Ben Siegel. So yes, there was a sense of philanthropy. Although it's also true to say that by the time Ben became a philanthropist, he wasn't earlier on. He had other things on his mind. But in the last months, there was, I think, a poignant sense, an awareness that he might not be living too long, and maybe he ought to try to do some good to atone. So he actually sponsored a couple fundraisers, one for Eddie Cantor, one for another actor of the day who was doing that sort of thing. And only later did I realize that the timing of those two events was poignant. It was just as his father died. The father who had spent his whole life working in the factory on the pants presser, who had never earned any money, died in about April of 1947. And my sense is that Ben was, giving this money as a kind of tribute to his father, maybe a way of sort of resolving those conflicted feelings between a mob son and the mob son's father. So he did do that, but there was a certain insanity to it at that point, because he had spent so much money on the Flamingo that to give $50,000 or $100,000 when millions were still needed to put the thing into operating order, it was a kind of crazy thing to do.
And a final question now from Francis. It sounds like Ben charmed you, Michael. Did your feeling about him change during the course of your writing?
Yeah, I never stopped liking him. I wrote a book about Andrew Cuomo. I stopped liking him. But I think that Ben was, he was complex. There was a kind of earnest ambition about him, even if it was tinged with a terrible temper and the capacity for killing someone. I think he really had that ambition in a way that I found sort of unexpectedly admirable. And let's not forget, at the end of the day, there was the Flamingo, this fabulous, first of its kind, glamorous hotel casino, which really had an enormous impact on the whole state, let alone the sort of gambling culture of the world. So yes, so I liked him. Would I have dinner with him? Maybe just a drink. Anyway.
You did mention Ratner's.
I did mention Ratner's. Okay. Oh, but not enough. If you all have one more minute here, I meant to say this earlier, that one of the murders that one of the hits that Meyer and Ben tried to commit was against a guy who was moving furs for them, only it turned out he was stealing the furs. So they did the classic thing. They put him in the back of a car and said, "We're going on a ride down this dark road." And the guy, his name was John Barrett, knew what fate held for him. So at about 40 miles an hour, he opens the door of this car, flies out, starts zigzagging down the road. The car comes to a screeching halt. They take out their Tommy guns. They begin firing him. He gets hit 4 times, but somehow manages to escape them and to slink into the Governor Hospital, which was down in the Lower East Side. And the next morning, Meyer and Ben went to Ratner's to talk it all over. And according to someone, I think I read in that Dean Jennings bio, Meyer says, "Oh, you missed the party. It was such fun." And the fun was that they almost shot him dead. So what a scene it must have been in Ratner's on an average weekday morning.
Well, by the way, I grew up hearing these stories because my grandfather owned Ratner's and all my aunts and uncles worked there and kind of ran it. And when I was a little boy, they would all tell stories of Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel and 8 or 9 other Jewish gangsters, all of whom to me had hilarious names because you never thought of Jews as tough Jews. And it was all Bugsy Siegel and King Kong Klein, and it just really tickled me. And all the waiters and all my relatives said Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky would come in, have breakfast, plot what they were going to do, their nefarious deeds, go out, commit crimes and kill people, and then come back for lunch and talk about it. So it's all true.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to end, I think. And thank you all for coming, for listening.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Peter, for sharing your evening with us. I know it's not the Flamingo or Ratner's, but I hope you all had fun with us this evening.
Great,
don't
thank
forget,
you.
And don't forget,
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Bugsy Siegel, links are in the chat. And you all have a lovely evening. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Will do.